This is a quick lecture video covering how to write the narrative essay using narration. So we're just going to go over some tips on using narration and how to construct it and how to organize it. So the first thing you want to know is that organizing a narrative essay involves thinking about your essay in 5 sections. So you start with the very beginning of the essay is exposition. That is, the beginning part should provide us with some context and background information in order to better understand the story. This is also the section where you might put in the date that it happened, how old you were, anything that's more contextual, so that when we get into the story itself, everything starts to make more sense. After that point, so that section is fairly short, 1 or 2 paragraphs. The next section of your essay is called rising action, and that's where the conflict starts, or so the event starts. So a lot of times students will kind of give us a little bit of background at the beginning, and then the second paragraph will start with, on such and such day, I woke up and this is what happened. And so that is where the actual conflict of the story starts to happen. And then we get what's called rising action. The rising action is the build up to whatever happened in your story. And so you think of the event of your story. Remember, you're choosing something within a day or less. And that's why, is because we want to make sure you have rising action up to a specific climactic event or something that happens, and then the ability to fall off from there. So if you choose something that happened over a day, so let's say you want to pick your entire trip to Cancun or something, that's fine, but you're going to summarize what happened at the beginning and you're going to summarize what happened at the end. You have to pick the focal point of the essay. So what is the moment in the essay? Maybe it was the sunset that you saw, or maybe it was getting bit by a shark. Whatever that climactic moment is that changed you somehow, that is what your focal point for the essay is. That's what you're building up to. So that rising action leads us up to the climax, the event, so the thing that happened. So when your leg broke, or when you decided to get on that bus, or whatever, you talk to that person, whatever it is that is the event, you're leading up to that. And so that is the high point of tension in the story as well. So that's what we're leading up to. And then the rest of the story is falling action. So that would be on the other side of the triangle there. Falling action leads us downward. And so that is just what happened afterwards. The ambulance was called and you were taken to the hospital or whatever. And so that falling action is the result of. And that leads us to the resolution, which is also the end of your story. That is where most students discuss the significance of the event, because we can't really understand why that event was significant until you actually tell us what the event was. And so that resolution at the end ends up being where students include basically their thesis. We talked about having that implied thesis that would be sort of at the end, or you might have a specific sentence that says, this is why this event was important to me, this is how I changed from it, and that's fine too. And so by the end, though, we need to understand, we wrap up the story, but also this is how you changed from it. So those are the 5 parts of your essay. And so I encourage students to actually outline their essay like this. What am I going to cover in the first section, the second section, and so on, and decide how their story is going to be laid out like this. It makes it easier to organize. So if you like to work with an outline, go ahead and outline using these 5 parts. Now, depending on your story, the climax may be closer to the beginning or closer to the end of the essay itself. So I like to give some examples here. Like a car crash, there's not a whole lot of rising action that leads up to it, because typically car crashes are just all of a sudden. And so you may be describing, where you were going and everything, but there's not going to be as much rising action. There's not as much tension building, because we jump right up to the climax itself. And then the falling action, it tends to be a little bit longer, because more of the story is actually going to happen in the falling action. Whereas a sports event, the climax is always going to be at the end. It's the winning or the losing of the event that is the climax. And so typically you'll get a whole lot more rising action out of a story like that than falling action, because we're building all of that tension. Are they going to win? Are they going to lose? And then we get to the high point, which is whether or not which one happens, right? So depending on your story, you may end up with more rising action or more falling action. The thing that you don't want are two climaxes. So you don't want to cover like both times that you went to the summer camp, right? Or the first day of summer camp and the last day of summer camp, which were the two special days. You have to pick one or the other. So that's why we want to make sure that you have one specific climax, and it may mean that you cut off some things that you otherwise would have described in more detail, or summarize them in fewer words so that it's not emphasized. So you kind of have to decide what is your emphasis and how are you going to play that out. The other thing that you wouldn't be thinking about is building tension or suspense as you lead up to the climax. So this is within the rising action. First of all, you want to make sure that you're starting with the contextual information and that you don't interrupt in the middle with like providing more of why we're doing this. So all of that should be at the beginning, because that's slower information. It's going to cut down on the taking away from the narrative. You guys have all watched a movie where it wasn't a very good movie because the pacing was bad, and this is why. Because you have to make sure that the stuff that you include in the middle does not retract or take away from how the story is going. So if the story is unfolding naturally, you don't want to suddenly interrupt it with like weird details about your mom or something. So context first, right? Plus we need to be grounded in the story. We need to understand where you're going, why you're going there, and when it is. Identification is another technique that you can use, and that is where you describe things that happen to you, not in present tense, in past tense, but you think about like a car crash. Some people can remember every single second of a car crash, and so it feels like it happened over a span of several minutes when it was actually just several seconds, whereas some people can't remember anything, and so it's just, bam, and then they're suddenly upside down. So you have to kind of decide how do you want to describe something as you experienced it. So can you slow that down a little and describe your internal emotions, how you were feeling too, and what you were thinking about and all that. Surprising the reader can also work. It does not work for all stories, but it can work if you have something that you can like withhold a detail and surprise. And so sometimes if you like mystery stories or that kind of type of writing, then definitely you can try it if you want to. It does not work for all stories, but it is a way to build some tension. Make your characters move around. That's important too. We tend to have dialogue, especially very static. If you're having an argument with your mom, you are not just standing still with your arms by your side. So make sure that you're including action. What are people doing in the scene? And so you want to think of the people in your story as characters, because the reader's going to see them as characters. To you, they're real people in your life, but we don't know them, and so we need some details about them and make them move around and give us some character and personality to them so that we can really understand who they are. You can use short sentences to build tension as well. Anytime you have a bunch of short sentences surrounded by long sentences, the short sentences will automatically be emphasized. And so you think about, there are some grammar rules that we get a little bit loose with in narrative writing, particularly fragments, especially when you're using it for emphasis or effect. So if you want to describe the car crash and you have a couple of really short sentences, that might be a very effective way to do it. Transitions, make sure that the transitions that you use are helping us to see the passage of time. And so thinking about like, okay, how long does it take to get from here to here? Then your transition is going to be 3 hours later or something like that. And so make sure those transitions are not only moving the story forward, but also showing us the passage of time and how things are related. You can also paraphrase dialogue if you have a lot of talking in your story, so you know that you had either a really long conversation with someone or someone gave a big speech like your coach. You can paraphrase some of that because dialogue does tend to slow the story down. So if your coach gave a really long, really nice speech, you might start off with the first thing that he said and then kind of summarize the middle part and then tell us the last thing or the most important or the thing that stuck out to you the most. And you could actually quote that instead of paraphrasing it. And we'll talk about lines of dialogue later, but just kind of keep in mind that that's an option, is you don't have to include every single thing that every person said if you have a lot of talking. And then also think about the place or setting to build tension or suspense. What is it about that place that was special or scary or important or whatever? You think about, like, if you're going to perform, what does it feel like to be in that backstage area and then step out onto the big open stage? Like, how does that help us see the internal tension that you might have been feeling? So those are just some ideas for you. You will use all of these in order to write the rough draft of your paper. Your rough draft should cover your story from beginning to end as much as possible with as much detail as possible. Obviously, for a peer edit, we want to make sure that we have enough of your story for someone to look over. So this video has just been using narration to write a story.